Hi everyone. I actually have lots of slides, but I'm going to highlight some, and let me tell you how I've organized it, and I'm going to send it out to you as well. So I'm really going to focus on the idea of TSI schools identified by student groups as an overview, but putting it in the context of Utah's accountability system. That's going to be the first part. The second part is going to be an examination of an exemplary Utah Title I school. And there are really interesting schools that it would benefit all of us to actually learn from, specifically the principal. I know this particular principal, and she gave a great presentation at the Title I meeting last year. And then we're going to focus on, so this is kind of our conditions, and so, what are the implications with a focus on evaluating effectiveness related to student outcomes, and then thinking more strategically about the allocation of resources related to TSI schools in particular, and then some effective practices from visible learning that has an effect percent of 0.5 or more. So that's kind of where we're going this afternoon. So this is, I think, a really great graphic. It's in the technical manual, and it's also connected to the school report cards. So if you look at, there's a clear focus on equity related to the lowest performing students. And it's the 25% of the lowest, the 25% of the lowest performing students in each of the schools. If you look at the high school indicators, you always have proficiency, but you notice that proficiency and growth here are equal as in the elementary school. Now, the reason this is important is the extent to which students are growing and improving from year to year from the previous year is really important for us to then analyze what that growth is for each of the students and have them analyze it, and then have them reflect on, what has made a significant difference. Because we should be asking the students based on the ability for them to self-assess and create metacognitive approaches to better understanding their own strengths to build on and to advocate for themselves as well. And that's actually connected to the idea of college and career readiness, which one of the key indicators is advocacy and metacognition, as well as working well with groups. So if you look at the EL, it's at the high school, it's 6% of the total accountability system, and it's connected to growth of the lowest 25%, which is identified by student group other than EL, which is ethnic minority. Then you have high school graduation, and there are other indicators as well. If you look at elementary school, there really is an important thing to look at here. So English learner progress is 9%. The growth of lowest 25% is 17%. Together, that's 25%, including growth of 37%. That ends up being the majority of the pie for elementary and middle school. So this is kind of the idea of where to focus in relationship to, encouraging students and supporting them related to understanding their goals for their own growth, and parents as well. So this is just a more detailed thing that is important because it talks about student performance on statewide assessments. And if you look at the way the 2017-28 proficiency is based on SAGE data for grades 3 through 10, 2018-2019 is going to be based on RISE for grades 3 through 8 and the Utah Aspire Plus for 9 and 10. Now, I'm going to do a session, even though I said I was going to discontinue webinars, I think this one is important. And I've done it before, but the blueprints for Utah Aspire Plus is somewhat troubling, and one reason it was selected because it's a better indicator of alignment to the ACT, because that was part of the legislation. But more importantly, there's a high level of emphasis on English grammar, as well as DOK 1, so recalling. So it'll be really important this next year. I think the data, from what I understand, will be coming out initially in September, but the report card will not be coming out until December, unfortunately, and part of that is because of the change and the standard setting for the writing, which, as you know, SAGE had writing in every single grade level. Okay, if you look at English learner progress, it's based on two key indicators. One is demonstrating adequate progress, and this is annual progress for each individual learner based on their proficiency when they entered the school system and the grade level at which they entered. And we'll talk more about that in another webinar related to the approval of the EL indicator. Also, there's one coming in from Granite School District, so I'm going to see if I can, not sure I can do this. I think Jerry will probably take care of it. If you look at the growth of the lowest 25%, it's academic improvement for the lowest performing students. And again, it's based on the previous 2 years of SAGE data for grades 3 through 10. In 2018 and 2019, the growth for accountability will compare 2017, 2018 SAGE to RISE and Utah Aspire. So there'll be comparisons. The additional indicators for high schools, the percentage of students graduating within 4 years, and 10% of points for graduation may be awarded for students who graduate within 5 years. So you can see there's an attempt to really understand particularly students with interrupted formal education in refugee communities. The ACT college readiness is based on the 11th grade ACT score, and it's the percentage of students earning the ACT overall composite score of 18 or higher. One way you can think about this, we actually do have business rules related to course taking patterns and the implication for taking biology in the 9th grade as different from earth science, and the implication for a higher ACT score. And then, of course, this key piece, which is important, related to the new board rule around advanced coursework. It includes students who earn a C or a better in advanced placement, concurrent enrollment, and international baccalaureates in CTE pathway, completers and concentrators. Okay, now, so this is a critical issue related to equitable access for a range of students. This is not based on whether they get a 2 on the AP exam or a 3 on the AP exam. It's about the actual success when you enroll students in one of these courses, and if they get a C or better. So that's an initiative that's been started for 2 years in relationship to equitable access to early college coursework and college readiness. Okay, so this is from the technical manual that's on the website, the assessment website, and accountability, and it's about determination. So here's the determination for TSI, which is, a targeted school improvement, and the LEA is accountable for looking at the data and then making adjustments in relationship to which student groups are identified. So each year, student groups that have at least 10 students in their group will have their achievement and growth. So you have the achievement score and the growth score calculated and then compared to the bottom 5 cut achievement and growth score. And any student group at or below this cut score then is identified as a low performing student group. And that's identified and tagged in a database that's on the school improvement website. So the student groups include race, ethnicity, students with disability, English learners, economically disadvantaged, and gender. I recently did an analysis, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, in relationship to schools that have one student group, that is an EL, or they have two student groups, usually an EL and students with disabilities, and then they also have student groups that are specifically related to minority groups, Black, Hispanic, and Polynesian and American Indian. These were the predominant groups that I saw where schools had multiple indicators, as many as 4 or 5, one occasion 6, students performing in the lowest 5%. Now, schools that are identified as TSI that do not improve the performance of the student groups of which they were identified within 4 years of identification will be identified as ATSI, which means consistently performing student groups. Any Title I school identified as TSI that does not improve the performance of the student groups for which they were identified within 4 years then becomes CSI schools, which is consistently underperforming student groups. Okay, so here's our data, and I mentioned, I think this in the ALS directors meeting, but here it is. There were 330 Utah schools identified for TSI for one or more student groups as targeted school improvement. 293 for EL, the EL student group. Among those 293, there were 20 high schools, 49 middle schools, and 124 elementary schools. And remember, this is the lowest academic achievement, 5% for achievement and growth for 2 consecutive years. Now, I find this interesting because a lot of schools and a lot of legislation talks about the use of increased technology and one-to-one devices. But we've seen this consistently, and I've seen this when I do monitoring, that being on a one-to-one device, having a student who's an English learner on a device while quality Tier 1 instruction is going on doesn't make any sense. So one of the key recommendations for at least 6 school districts that we've seen is review and evaluate the effectiveness of the use of technology as well as the use of specific interventions and if they actually are making a difference. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So what is growth? This is the way it's defined in the technical manual. So students are assessed concept skills taught in the classroom, measuring how well the students met the state grade level expectations in each subject. Okay, so we're focusing on each subject, which is English language arts, mathematics, and science, and their grade level expectations. This measure shows the amount of improvement or growth students have made in each subject, illustrating whether students are learning and improving. To provide the context, growth in each subject area on the report card is noted as high, typical, or low. Now we're going to look at a report card, school report card, and when you view the details, you can see how the school is compared to district and the state and how student groups performed in each area. So if you haven't gone to the website, the Data Gateway, and looked at the school report card in depth, I would really recommend it, and to work with administrators as well. So we're going to look at the equity indicator specifically. And remember, the equity indicator is based on the growth of the lowest 25%. So this is an exemplary growth. This is in a Title I distinguished school, and this school happens to be in elementary school in Provo. Okay, so if you look at the growth, you see English language arts at 63%, mathematics at 67%, science at 65%. And the growth for the lowest 25%, is 73%, which is high. This particular school I think it's something like, it might even be 100% poverty, but 95% poverty and at least 60 or 75% English learners. So let's look at the growth of the lowest 25%. The students in the lowest 25%, their growth is 73%. So in comparison, we see that all of the students at that school progressed 78%. 78% of the students progressed, right? Based on the indicator. And the lowest 25% of that school's students also progressed. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is oftentimes when people talk about closing the achievement gap, there are students who continually, generally, are making progress. And the way we think about closing the achievement gap is they don't grow. The students who are the kind of regular education students without specific indicators related to identifying them as a disaggregated student group is not the same. So this is really important because the regular ed students are making progress as well. Okay, let's look at the way the school performs compared to the district in the state. Okay, now remember, this is the percent of students who were in the lowest 25% and their growth average. So the school, 73%, district 58, and the state is 61. Okay, now we're going to look at science. Now, the reason we're looking at science is, I think, pretty interesting because you can see that the school average in academics and science is pretty high. It's 66%, higher than the district average and higher than the state average. So the question is, what is it that they're doing in science that's making a significant difference? That's the kind of the questions that we should be asking when districts are looking at their own data and looking at the student groups and by subject area and academic growth. Remember, these are growth indicators. So economically disadvantaged is 67%, students with disabilities 71, and English learners 73. It's the highest science by student group that I've seen probably in the state, which is pretty significant. I've seen some of the best science instruction at the elementary school in the 4th grade in 2 different schools. One school in an urban setting, the other school in a very rural setting. And what distinguished these exemplary practices was the quality of the questions that the teachers asked the students for their judgments about why they're responding in a particular way. One teacher said, when they were reviewing, she said, now, I'm going to read you the test. I'm going to read you this quiz, because this isn't a reading test. It's about your knowledge of science. It's your knowledge of science and the pressures and the metamorphic changes in relationship to, rocks, the rock system, the way in which, and it was really powerful. And both of these teachers were very open to the really amazing questions that students asked. One was a Title I, well, both actually were Title I schools, but very, in very different contexts. I'm also going to show you the mathematics of the school. Again, if you look at it, you see the school average is 67%. So you have to ask yourself, here we have a Title I school, high poverty, high English learners, and math and science scores are very high in relationship to how students are growing. Remember, this is the growth indicator. It's the growth indicator of the lowest 25%. We consider that the equity indicator. Okay, so we're going to talk about these 3 key principles. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, and then I'm going to send it to you, because I have actually another meeting at 3. So these are 3 key principles that have been used and generated from a research perspective at Stanford University. and adopted in Nevada for their key principles in working with English learners. So one is opportunity to learn. We could talk forever about this in relationship to who has access, equitable access to which courses, and how students are considered to be prepared for these classes. So the new board rule will, I think, pretty much change that because there won't be requirements. It'll be open enrollment. So it's really about opportunities to engage with conceptual understanding and language competence related to analytical practices. So you're actually developing these opportunities to learn. It's Vygotsky as well as Cummins and all the people who talk about the level of academic rigor a little bit beyond the language proficiency levels. And the WIDA key uses can support the way in which teachers redesign their instruction. Of course, standards align instruction for Yale, rigorous, grade level appropriate, and deliberate and appropriate scaffolds. Now, the scaffolds that we've seen have ranged from, brilliant to not very clear. So we're going to look at some, here's something from Visible Learning. It's focusing on instructional strategies with a 0.5 effect size that support ELs. So if you look at what this is saying, 1.29, it's about, increased cognitive task, focuses on problem solving, memory, attention, judgment, decision making. And I inserted DOK level 3 because we've actually seen in classroom visits teachers as early as second grade and first grade. I think it was a first grade classroom, and it was a science class, and they were doing this incredible experiment with water and looking at buoyancy with different objects, and her questions were just quite extraordinary. And it was all based on supporting hard evidence for conclusions, based on what they were observing and what they were testing out. You look at the jigsaw method, scaffolding, planning, prediction, problem solving, teaching. All of these are high level of student engagement and also academic conversation, which focuses on the use of academic vocabulary within the context of solving a real problem. I've seen this in mathematics as well. So what does the opportunity to learn mean? And these are the DOK levels. So this is what it means. It's what the teachers are doing. The teachers are using questions to build schema, to model and scaffold conceptual understanding by asking questions like, well, why? This first grade teacher was asking the kids, what are the conditions that make this balloon act differently in the water than this balloon? So she was, doing this amazing conceptualization related to the question she was asking, and the kids were great. And again, questions to probe reasoning, thinking, peer discourse, self-reflection. How do you know this? I saw a first grade classroom where the teacher had the kids working together with whiteboards and they were doing sequencing. And she said, okay, so you have to figure out what number is coming next. And then you have to talk with your partner and decide why you're picking this number. And it looks like in a classroom, I gave you some examples, students engaged in verbal interactions. One of the things that we found predominantly is that the kinds of questions that are being asked are just recounting information. Okay, that's not learning. That's memorizing and repeating back. The point is, what does the classroom environment look like when students are making connections across disciplinary concepts and ideas? I saw this in the science class where the kid was actually saying, oh, this is like the Grand Canyon. He was talking about the function of sedimentary rock and also topsoil in relationship to growth. So the second one is asset orientation. I saw this was totally brilliant in a high school class. And it's leveraging the home language, the cultural assets, the whole prior knowledge and the experience based on a really interesting prompt for a question based on a text that had been read the day before. And this was a level 2 EL class, and it was taking into consideration language proficiencies. There were multiple languages in there with refugee students. And the asset, and these are the effect sizes: parent involvement, early interventions at home. The school environment with the assets is really a collective teacher efficacy. And I'm just going to say one thing. So if you have if you have 3 fourth grade classrooms and you have this amazing teacher in one of the classrooms, what is the function of the PLCs in relationship to upscaling and disseminating practices that continually support advanced growth and student outcomes? What does that look like? And here are some examples about assets. I'll just pick out one. Students using multimodal materials, scaffolds for purposeful learning of content, analytical practices, and language. And I saw this in an 8th grade math class by a first-year teacher who was using, she was actually teaching the Pythagorean theorem. She was using visuals, she was using whiteboard, she was using diagrams, she was using total physical response. So I've actually seen brilliant examples of instruction that makes a difference. So the last one of the principles is developing autonomy. The point of developing autonomy is that when students know the strategies that help them gain not only language in an academic setting, but support them in setting their own goals and advocating for themselves, then this is a key principle. And I've seen this where a teacher says, okay, so now you've done the first draft, we're going to do editing, and you're going to identify your editing skills and whether you need more help and support, or whether you're more skillful in how you're becoming skillful. So you're just going to analyze, this is your first draft, now you're going back and looking at your editing skills. So the affective filter a safe learning environment without judgment. Okay, this is pretty key. I think I've showed this before, and it's about, this is the major thing that we found. Teachers are still talking way too much. The increase of student talk is critical. And this is an example of a continuum from conversational language, right, that goes all the way up to academic language. And these are just tiny examples that show the continuum. But when people are observing each other and giving each other feedback, it should be focused on, the way in which instruction is scaffolded in the very, very beginning, so that students then are actually together or in pairs or on teams or however are using academic conversation to solve real problems. And that goes back to this issue of quality Tier 1 instruction, which is actually a civil right for equitable access. In many schedules in many schools that we visited, there are tons of interventions, and yet there's still not progress for students. So the question is, how do we use the data to evaluate the way in which interventions are not really being supportive, but in fact are keeping kids from quality Tier 1 instruction? AVID is an example. We took course-taking patterns from students who had gotten full scholarships to the Eccles Business School. And what we found is students at the elementary level who score a 5 on WIDA, at least by the 5th grade, end up having access to increased rigorous coursework. And the point of AVID is that this is the point. It's a course that really focuses on student advocacy, self-advocacy, and analysis of the quality of their work and the kinds of questions they're asking and the kind of help they're getting from their peers. Okay, so this is a question, how are individual student reports from multiple sources used to inform classroom instruction and make policy decisions for allocation of resources to increase teacher effectiveness? Now, that's a big question. But one of the examples that we saw was a principal who was tracking students, all her English learners, on Dibbles. And, this whole thing about fidelity and being on the computer, and when I saw the students who were using it, not at this school but another school, the math didn't use the math language, and it looked like it was a worksheet that was just transposed, on a screen with no conversation, with partners or anything like that. But what this principal saw was, even though the students were having intervention through software, it wasn't making a significant difference. And so she hired someone to be an ESL person, went to the district, got different resources, and within 6 months, the relationship between the students, the work that they were doing with the families, made a huge difference. And the Dibble scores, showed huge increase just for that one indicator related to relationship and conversation. Okay, so I'm a little bit over, but I hope you send me questions. I'm really thinking of developing something in the Utah grants system which will track how we monitor the progress of moving schools out of TSI for 2 consecutive years, and how we learn from each other, not just across the state, but with actually in the school districts. There's so much diversity within school districts in feeder patterns, where there's one school who's not in TSI, has high number of ELs, but that continuity is not really connected, or people have difficulty learning from each other. So think about the way in which you're working with schools and principals, and commending the kinds of work that teachers are doing. So thanks so much. I appreciate we've gone over a little bit, but I'll send this out to you probably tomorrow.